If you're playing Arise Crossover, then you already know, shadows aren't just summons, they're the backbone of your entire strategy. Picking the right ones can be the difference between dominating every fight and getting stuck, wishing you could set foot on solo leveling island. In this video, we've put together the ultimate shadows tier list, ranking them based on strength, versatility, and overall impact. Whether you're looking for the best frontline tanks, high damage dealers, or utility picks, we've got you covered. Plus, we'll be sharing some must-know tips to help you maximize your shadows and climb to the top. Before we get started, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more Arise Crossover guides and tier lists. Now, let's dive in. B-tier Arise Crossover Shadows. When it comes to shadows in Arise Crossover, B-tier picks aren't necessarily useless, but they start to show their weaknesses as you progress. They might work fine in the early game, but compared to stronger shadows, they just don't hold up. Whether it's lackluster damage, unreliable abilities, or simply being outclassed, these shadows should only be used if you have no better options. Let's break down the ones that land in this tier. Dake. Dake is essentially a slightly better version of Sundu, but that's not saying much. It primarily relies on melee strikes and performs a flurry attack every 3 to 4 seconds, which sounds good on paper, but the actual impact is underwhelming. In the early game, you might find Dake somewhat useful, especially if you don't have stronger shadows yet. However, when compared to LongIn, Largalgan, or even Anders, it just doesn't compete. The damage output is mediocre, and it lacks any real utility or tankiness that could make it stand out. If you're still using Dake past the early stages, you should be looking to swap it out ASAP for something stronger. Sundu. Sundu is the very first shadow you'll encounter in Arise Crossover, and unfortunately, it's also the weakest. While it might feel cool at first to summon your first shadow, Sundu falls off almost immediately. The biggest problem? Its damage output is just way too low. Even against basic enemies, it struggles to keep up, and as soon as you start facing tougher opponents, Sundu becomes nothing more than a liability. That being said, Sundu does have one very specific use case, fusion. If you manage to collect 4 Sundus, you can combine them to create Ganchi, which is at least a step up. Additionally, you'll need to use Sundu to get your first LongIn, which is far more useful in battle. Other than that, there's no real reason to keep Sundu around. The sooner you can replace it, the better. Final thoughts on B tier. Both Dake and Sundu suffer from the same core issue, they're outclassed by better shadows in almost every way. While they might serve a purpose in the very early stages of the game, they quickly become dead weight. If you're using either of these shadows, make sure you're actively looking for replacements. In the next tier, we'll start getting into shadows that can actually hold their own in battle. Let me know if you want any tweaks before moving on to A tier. A tier Arise Crossover Shadows. Now we're getting into the shadows that can actually carry their weight in battle. A tier shadows are strong, reliable, and worth investing in, though they might not be quite as game-changing as the absolute best. If you want to progress efficiently without feeling like you're constantly struggling, these are the shadows you should focus on. Largalgan. Largalgan should be your second priority, right after securing a quadruple LongIn stack. You'll mostly find these shadows grouped up on the overpass ahead of the Soul City spawn point, though their drop rate leaves a lot to be desired. Farming them can be a grind, but trust me, once you have a 4 stack of Largalgan, it's well worth the effort. If you're not looking to go all in on Largalgan, a solid alternative strategy is running 2x Anders and 2x Largalgan. This setup provides a strong mix of power and survivability, making it a great stepping stone toward higher tier shadows. Ganchi. Ganchi might get a lot of hate, but it does its job perfectly in the early game, helping you get rid of weaker Sundus. It's not a long-term pick, but if you need something functional before you can build a stronger shadow army, Ganchi is a workhorse that can hold things down. That said, you shouldn't hold on to Ganchi for too long. Once its damage caps out between 30 to 50, it's time to replace it with LongIn or Anders. These shadows offer way more damage and utility, making Ganchi obsolete past the early stages. Anders. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of Anders. It's not bad, but compared to other shadows in this tier, it doesn't stand out as much. The one good thing? Farming them is easy. You'll find them concentrated right below the LongIn overpass, making them simple to grind for if you need to round out your team. While Anders might not be flashy, grabbing 2 of them can help stabilize your squad until you're ready to move on to Vermillion. If you're in a position where you don't have access to top-tier shadows yet, Anders can serve as a temporary core, but don't get too attached, it's just a stepping stone. Final thoughts on a tier. These shadows are strong, flexible, and great for mid-game progression. Whether you're stacking LongIns, using Gonchi as a stopgap, or running Anders as a temporary solution, this tier is full of solid choices. However, if you really want to dominate, you'll need to aim even higher. Now, let's move on to S tier, where we cover the absolute best shadows in Arise Crossover. Before we get into S tier, if you're enjoying the video so far and finding this tier list helpful, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're always dropping the latest Arise Crossover guides, tier lists, and updates, so don't miss out. Now, let's move on to the S tier shadows, the absolute best picks in the game. S tier Arise Crossover shadows. We've finally reached the top tier shadows, the ones that completely change the way you play Arise Crossover. These shadows aren't just strong, they're game-defining. If you manage to get them, you'll have a massive advantage over anyone still struggling with weaker options. Vermillion, the absolute best. There's no argument, Vermillion is the most powerful shadow in Arise Crossover, at least in Solo City. It boasts the highest damage output, allowing you to clear enemies faster than any other shadow. Whether you're fighting tough bosses or grinding mobs, Vermillion delivers relentless destruction. However, there's a catch, actually getting a Vermillion is an absolute nightmare. The drop rate is incredibly low, and if you're aiming for an Arise, you'd better be prepared for a serious grind. Personally, it took me at least a dozen attempts before I finally added one to my squad. But once you do, it's an absolute game changer. If you're serious about dominating Arise Crossover, Vermillion should be your #1 endgame goal. It's hard to get, but once you have it, you'll never look back. LongIn, the must-have shadow. If there's one shadow you must get as soon as possible, it's LongIn. This shadow isn't just strong, it doubles your power the moment you obtain it. Thanks to its fiery spear attack, LongIn deals devastating bursts of damage that make it a threat in every battle. The best strategy? Go for 4x LongIn as soon as possible. The reason? Its special attack is by far the best in the game. If you've seen it in action, you already know what I'm talking about, it completely melts through enemies. With Vermillion and a stacked LongIn lineup, you'll have one of the strongest shadow setups possible. Once you secure these two, you're set for success. Final thoughts on S tier. These shadows are unstoppable and should be your top priority if you want to dominate the game. Vermillion's raw power and LongIn's fiery spear attacks make them the best shadows in Arise Crossover. That wraps up our shadow tier list. If you found this helpful, drop a like and subscribe for more tier lists, guides, and updates. Let us know in the comments how many LongIns you've got and if you've been lucky enough to snag a Vermillion.